This is part 2 of chapter 1, and will feature topics like anarcho-nihilism, collision, and the ceaseless lager. Anarcho-nihilism, uhu. A nihilist is a person who does not bow down to any authority, who does not accept any principle on faith, however much that principle may be revered. Ivan Turgenev. The anarcho-nihilist position is that essentially we are fucked. That the current manifestation of human society, civilization, Leviathan, industrial society, global capitalism, whatever, is beyond salvation, and so our response to it should be one of unmitigated hostility. There are no demands to be made, no utopic visions to be upheld, no political programs to be followed. The path of resistance is one of pure negation. In short, that conditions in the social organization are so bad as to make destruction desirable for its own sake, independent of any constructive program or possibility. Aragorn traces the history of nihilism to 19th century Russia, where the suffocating environment of Tsarism created a breeding ground for a purely negative strain of socialism. What started as a philosophical rejection of conventional morality and aesthetics laid the groundwork for a youth-driven counterculture of hedonism, communalism, and proto-hipster fashion. This eventually birthed a revolutionary force that sought the absolute destruction of state traditions, social order, and classes in Russia, not as a part of a program for social change, but based on a deeply held belief that destruction was worthwhile for its own sake. Though Russian nihilism was eventually squashed by the state, the ideas spread and have recently seen a resurgence within anarchist currents. After 2 centuries of failed revolutions, nihilism has perhaps become even more disinterested in conventional socialist programs and radical milieus. It has also been armed with the decades of an anarchist and post-structuralist theory that have helped to cultivate its critiques of domination, meta-narratives, teleological structures, gender, and civilization as a whole. Streams of communiques from anarcho-nihilist groups detailing incendiary actions have been backed by a surge of publications exploring nihilist approaches to the problem of domination in today's world, both of which have led to the occasionally useful lines of dialogue between nihilists and other anarchists. Though some strains of nihilism certainly arrive at a place of paralysis, the strain that collides with anarchism tends to be one of explosive creativity and relentless action. On the path of negation, anarcho-nihilism spurns positive programs for social change, challenges dominant modes of time, and discovers a tactical freedom by disregarding inherited moralities and political traditions, among other positions. Collision. We are not anarchists by Bakunin or the CNT, but by our grandmothers. Julita Paredes. I began thinking about this text in Toronto, where my 93-year-old grandmother lives on the 7th floor of a high-rise apartment overlooking Highway 401. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows in her kitchen, the horizon is swallowed by 12 lanes of concrete and an endless river of traffic, equal parts terrifying and hypnotic. How many gruesome stories are written into this one landscape? The concrete road tells the story of the colonization of Turtle Island. The commuter traffic tells the story of mass domestication under the rhythms of capitalism. The billowing smog tells the story of the future that's almost too frightening to believe. Drinking tea quietly, my grandmother is clearly unfazed by this ominous procession. It is the world she knows now and accepts. In a previous chapter of her life, she confronted and survived a very different infrastructure of death. As a young adult, the bunkers, the factories, and crematorium of Auschwitz defined nearly a year of her life. Her experiences of the Nazi Holocaust sit close with me as I look over this glowing ribbon of death and wrestle with the ideas of nihilism. To what extent do I remain attached to the society that I despise? What would it mean to sever those attachments? If this were Nazi Germany expanding out before me, how would I live my life? What if I were in my grandmother's position in 1943? What does it mean to resist against such a catastrophically extensive and overwhelming system? This collision of anarcho-nihilism and concentration camp resistance came about primarily as a coincidence of literary indulgences. At the same time as I poured my way through Bowden, a queer nihilist journal, still one of the best nihilist texts I've ever encountered, I also stumbled upon my first memoir of resistance from the Warsaw Ghetto. As so often happens, connections began to jump off the page, and it seemed ideal to pursue these 2 subjects simultaneously. Since then, I have found that they speak poignantly to one another, and when we held together seemed to create a stereoscopic depth that has helped me to to grapple with the weight of both topics simultaneously. I'll admit from the outset that I have low ambitions for this project. My intention is not to comprehensively explain, reinvent, or critique nihilism or anarchism more generally. Rather, I want to feel out these ideas and see how far they can take me. Like the authors of the nihilist journal Atenat, I am interested in finding tools, not answers, with an emphasis on building. Similarly, I have no aspirations to shed new light on the Nazi Holocaust or offer any startling new interpretations. Despite all of my research, the subject still feels somewhat untouchable, an end to a conversation rather than a beginning. If nothing else, I would like to unearth some stories of resistance that do not often get told, and in doing so, to bring the Holocaust into the realm of anarchist thought in a meaningful way, so that at least we have something to say about it. I hope to open our doors to other anarchists who have a personal connection to these histories, or who share an interest, so that we might incorporate them into our lives in productive ways. At heart, this book is about tapping into the instinctual rebelliousness that resides underneath of every organization, affinity group, project, and action that we participate in. That reflexive spirit of resistance rooted in the basic existential understanding that recalcitrance is simply a more meaningful and joyous form of existence than docility. Too often our insurrectionary urges get bogged down in ideological costume, rhetorical mandate, and hobbyist paradigms. We channel our energies into dubious conduits of prefabricated dogma and inevitably burn out or become listless at the very mention of revolution. Forms of resistance rooted in the social obligations and lifestyle choices all too often fade into lives of despondency, alienation, boredom, or material comfort. It speaks to the very nature of our domestication that we only choose resistance so long as it feels like something we can win. That's where nihilism enters the picture. I'm interested in this sort of nihilist resistance we pursue, not because we necessarily believe it will produce desired changes or lead us to a brighter future, but because it's the most meaningful response to this world we can imagine. Because we simply can't stomach the idea of being passive in the face of a system this brutal, regardless of how far we may be from our dreams. Nihilism urges anarchists to embrace our feelings of cynicism around radical milieus, or our feelings of boredom with prescribed methods of resistance, our feelings of hopelessness in the current landscape of domination, and to engage in forms of revolt that cultivate immediate joy and moments of liberation. And that's where the Nazi Holocaust becomes particularly interesting. Concentration camp resistance challenges nihilism to consider just how bleak it is willing to get. The resistance of those in lagers who are deprived of every vestige of hope, every morsel of inspiration, and every shred of comfort poses rich questions about how much hopelessness we are willing to wade through for a chance to fight back. It reminds us that resistance is not just about getting results, but about our reflexive reactions to oppressive situations. Whether we succeed in overthrowing our oppressors and bringing about a brighter future can only be secondary to the visceral need to rebel against the shitty conditions of our lives. Both topics, anarcho-nihilism and concentration camp resistance, challenge anarchists to realize a spirit of resistance that can endure horrific conditions, that can weather the storms of absolute futility, and that can still muster an exuberant desire to rebel. The ceaseless lager. The Holocaust experience is a very condensed version of most of what life is all about. Dory Laub. This is not a book about happy endings. Almost every story ends with mass torture, slaughter, and enslavement. When the liberation of the camps occurred, it was not because internal resistance had brought the Nazis to their knees, but because of the arrival of a different team of imperial state armies. A typical leftist approach to this topic might try to emphasize the effectiveness of concentration camp resistance, to paint portraits of heroes who hastened the end of the war, or to celebrate the moments of successful escape. A nihilist approach might be just as content to emphasize all of the times that action accomplished nothing, all of the times that rebel strategies failed, all of the acts of resistance that did not even survive for us to hear about them, to stand back with all of that information and still to be able to say, "That's great!" From a nihilistic approach, we can celebrate the failures of resistance, because in them we find a sort of resiliency and substance that may serve us better in our current situations than mere stories of triumph. Though it would be ludicrous to overpronounce a comparison between our situations today and the concentration camps of World War II, The institutionalized brutality and the systemic disempowerment many of us feel certainly resonates. Many of us who experience or at least recognize the horrors of modern society can relate to those before us who were turned into numbers, deprived of the last vestiges of human dignity, and were used to subjugate Häftlinge, the prisons that were used to contain them, and the underlying logic of Nazi Germany that made the camps possible all persist in abundance. Those who have survived the ongoing 500-year colonization of Turtle Island will surely recognize many of these as the same methods used to displace and eradicate their people, and that continue to serve colonial states at their expense. The colonization of this land was, after all, of great personal inspiration to Hitler himself. For a variety of reasons, history has exceptionalized this particular genocide, but I've come to understand it as part of an unbroken continuum of domination that neither began nor ended with Hitler. It's important to remember that the Nazis didn't have to build all of their own camps. Some of that work was done by the social democratic governments prior. Nor did they have to decommission all of them after the war. The Soviets put a couple of them to good use. Let's also remember that the post-war trials of Nazi doctors were conducted under the explicit understanding that most governments of the world are guilty of perverse, unconsensual human experimentation. Most notably, the United States, from where many of the Nuremberg judges came, had been involved in this kind of brutal scientific experimentation throughout much of the 20th century, infecting prisoners with malaria plasmodia, infecting death row prisoners with pellagra, or testing the effects of nuclear radiation on general populations. The Nazis were only found or remembered as guilty because they lost the war. Their camps were not fundamentally unique, though they certainly brought a devastating industrial flair to the whole concept. Giorgio Agamben has aptly argued that the concentration camp is the defining feature of modern politics, as it represents a site of exception from the enlightened facade of civilized society. Indeed, everywhere we look today we see Nazi machinations at work, though these parallels are often too controversial to utter, and yet for those willing to see it, from the Gaza Strip to the Toronto Immigration Holding Center, from the factory farms to the Alberta tar sands, the logic of the civilization continues to show its true colors. In order for some to live safely, others must be declared Ballestexistensen and be shackled, violated, and killed. In order for humans to thrive, the earth and all of its other inhabitants must be subjugated and ravaged. Although the uniforms have changed and the tactics have evolved, the same basic struggle against domination continues. The phrase "never again," repeated often by victims and descendants of the Nazi Holocaust, rings more and more hollow with every passing moment. This concludes Chapter 1. Tune in next time for Chapter 2, Introduction to Concentration Camp Resistance. Ooh woo.